Hello, and welcome to Benjamin Franklin, a WTTW preview and community conversation. My name is Tim Russell, Vice President, Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT, and our purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. Benjamin Franklin, a new two-part documentary directed by filmmaker Ken Burns, will premiere on all WTTW platforms on April 4th and April 5th at 8 p.m. Central. I hope you will explore our companion website at wttw.com/Ken Burns Benjamin Franklin. The film, written by Dayton Duncan and produced by David Schmidt and Ken Burns, explores the life and work of one of the most consequential figures in American history, a prolific writer, a publisher, a groundbreaking scientist and inventor, a world-renowned diplomat, and a signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. Every American learns about Benjamin Franklin in grade school, but often it ends there. Benjamin Franklin was a fascinating and complicated individual who helped shape our contemporary world. If we see him for more than his long list of accomplishments, we recognize an imperfect man, challenging himself and his contemporaries as he tries to understand and improve the world around him. Today, you will have the opportunity to preview selections from the film, and Paris Schutz, co-anchor of WTTW's Chicago Tonight, will moderate today's conversation. Before we begin, major support for the WTTW presentation of Benjamin Franklin comes from Rita and John Canning and Marshall Field V, and our members which help us fulfill our purpose to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. Now, let's watch the introduction to the film, followed by Paris Schutz, co-anchor of Chicago Tonight.
Histories of lives are seldom entertaining unless they contain something either admirable or exemplar. Know then that I am an enemy to vice and a friend to virtue, a mortal enemy to arbitrary government and unlimited power. I am naturally very jealous for the rights and liberties of my country, and the least appearance of an encroachment on those invaluable privileges is apt to make my blood boil exceedingly. Benjamin Franklin.
Franklin is by far the most approachable of our founders. He's not somebody made of stone like a George Washington. Franklin was pretty simple in his moral code. He was driven by a desire to pour forth benefits for the common good. But there's a lot in Benjamin Franklin that makes you flinch. And we see Franklin not as a perfect person, but somebody evolving to see if he could become more perfect.
He was a teenage runaway who achieved such remarkable success that his example would be handed down for generations as the embodiment of the American dream. He was a printer, a publisher, and a writer, producing everything from essays on politics and religion to biting satires and words of wisdom that would endure forever. He was a prolific inventor and a scientist whose pioneering discoveries would make him the most famous American in the world. He was a civic leader, the founder of a library and a college who introduced a host of improvements that made the lives of everyday people better. He embraced the Enlightenment belief in the perfectibility of human beings, but no one understood their foibles and failings, including his own, better than he did. He also owned and enslaved human beings and benefited from the institution of slavery. He was a reluctant revolutionary who became an indispensable founder of a new nation, helped craft the document that declared his country's independence, and then did as much as anyone to secure the victory that assured it. and he guided the complicated compromises that created his nation's constitution, then tried to rectify its central failing.
He constantly remade himself, from apprentice to printer to scientist to government official to revolutionary to abolitionist. He never was finished with himself. He always thought that he was a work in progress.
He could be funny and unforgiving, folksy and philosophical, generous and shrewdly calculating, broad-minded yet deeply prejudiced. A family man who spent years away from his wife and let political differences destroy his relationship with his son. He concealed those contradictions behind a carefully crafted public image.
He's a Puritan who then becomes the leading figure in the Enlightenment. So he stands astride so many contradictions in his own life that he understands them, and they don't become contradictions for him. They become some seamless web of insight.
He wrote so much, he wrote so well. He's somebody that we need to know about. He can put us in touch with the sensibilities of the 18th century in a way that makes it both accessible and yet captures its remoteness.
Franklin is endlessly interesting. He is the only founding father who evidently had a sense of humor, who was evidently human, who evidently had a sex life. And there's so much about him that makes him seem approachable on the one hand and superhuman on the other hand.
Let all men know thee, Benjamin Franklin said, but no man know thee thoroughly.
I never intend to wrap my talent in a napkin. To be brief, I am courteous and affable, good-humored, unless I am first provoked, and handsome, and sometimes witty. If you would not be forgotten as soon as you are dead and rotten, either write things worth reading or do things worth the writing. Benjamin Franklin.
All right. I don't know about you all, but I kind of want to keep watching that. What an incredible tease. What an incredible intro. I'm Paris Schutz, co-anchor, as Tim mentioned, with Chicago Tonight here on WTTW. We're really thrilled to have all our guests with us. We're thrilled to have our participants. And I should let all of you know that though you can't talk, there's no talking function here. You can submit your questions into the chat. So near the end of our conversation, we're going to take public questions. And so I'll just be able to access them if you go to the chat function and you send them there. And let's introduce our panelists. First, we have Jason Coleman. He is the co-founder and executive director of Project SYNcERE. That's an educational not-for-profit organization whose mission is to prepare the minds and create pathways for underrepresented and disadvantaged students to pursue careers in STEM fields. We also have Dr. Rabiah Mayas. She is the Ruth D. and Ken M. Davey Vice President of Education at Museum of Science and Industry. She also oversees the groundbreaking Welcome to Science Initiative, a suite of education programs dedicated to removing barriers to science education through interactive, hands-on, and innovative learning experience. And my favorite, science communicator. She makes it make sense for me, and that's a heck of a skill there. And David Schmidt, producer of Benjamin Franklin, he spent his entire career at Florentine Films, beginning as an intern and rising with the company to senior producer. He's currently producing a 5-part documentary on the American Revolution, just a small topic there, with Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein, and Salima El Amin. And that series is set for broadcast on PBS in 2025. So welcome all of you. We really appreciate you being here. David, I want to start with you and digging into this and looking at all the stuff that was written about Franklin and putting this film together. What surprised you the most about his life?
There's so much that surprised me. You know, I grew up in Colonial Williamsburg, Virginia. And so I would, played the fife marching down the street there and like to tell people I grew up in 1774. And so I thought I knew a little bit about the 18th century in America, and I didn't. And I definitely didn't know very much about Benjamin Franklin and how much he impacted that world and the world that we inherited. The the thing that maybe surprised me the most, well, I should start a little sooner. I didn't know that he enslaved people. I feel like I should have known that, but I didn't. I didn't know that he profited from the sale of slaves and notices for runaways in his newspaper. I didn't know that. It makes sense because he was so much a part of the colonial economy that revolved around the institution of slavery. But I didn't know that. That wasn't the thing that surprised me the most. The thing that surprised me the most was that his son, William, who he had been incredibly close with, who was his only witness and only collaborator in the Kite and the Key experiment that we're going to talk about later, he chose the other side in the American Revolution and was at a time before Benedict Arnold became the traitor that we know him as, was arch enemy number one as an American on the other side in the American Revolution, on the side of the British, on the side of the loyalists to the king. He was the royal governor of New Jersey, in part because Franklin, his father, Benjamin Franklin, helped him get that job. The two of them had been promoting the British Empire in North America for decades, and then the war drove them apart. And Benjamin Franklin, never forgave his son, who spent 4 years in captivity during the American Revolution, a political prisoner in the United States. Never forgave him, and they were divided, as so many other families were, by that civil war in North America and the American Revolution.
Right,
so that was what surprised me the most.
Amazing part of history that you outlined there. And David, you kind of focus on his obsessive curiosity, insatiable curiosity, and his obsessive desire to form a more perfect self. Where did the language "form a more perfect union" come from?
Yeah.
What drove all of that?
Yeah, I mean, more perfect is the perfect phrase to choose. When he was in his 20s, he created an epitaph for himself, and I don't remember the whole thing, but it basically said, "Here lies Benjamin Franklin. He's here, food for worms." He believes that he will return in a more perfect edition, corrected by the author. So more perfect, I don't know exactly where it came from in the Constitution, but it's certainly something he was thinking about as a young man. I don't know what drove him, but I don't know what drove him to become so self-obsessed, but I'm so glad that he was, because I think it made him who he was. One of the people in our film says that he's his own best self-invention.
Right. And speaking of invention, Rabiah Mayas, there's some parts in the film about his legendary experiments with electricity. It's so funny because at the time, the film describes that, electric shocks were kind of like this magic trick, that people did at magic shows. So what does it say about the nature of innovation that he took something that was kind of like some kind of fun entertainment and said, there might be something more here?
Yeah, I think it says a lot about the nature of human curiosity. And to some extent, Benjamin Franklin was extraordinary. And in some ways, I think he was very ordinary and had an extraordinary life, right? And so the idea that observation and paying attention to the world around you and asking questions about things is really the root of so much discovery. But we often silence it in ourselves and in each other. Like, oh, I don't really need to worry about that. We might tell a child to stop asking so many questions because they're bothering us. But that kind of curiosity, that energy about understanding, wanting to understand, right? Why is something the way that it is? What could I do to make this better, different, more interesting and fun, is really at the root of so much that we think about in the education space around scientific discovery and exploration, the kinds of habits of mind and skills that you might develop. And part of the thing that I thought was really fascinating about this story was learning how Benjamin Franklin experienced the world around him, interpreted the world around him, and also the supports he had to nurture that kind of spirit from a young age all the way through adulthood.
Well, and Jason, that sort of dovetails into what you do as a mentor to kids that are underrepresented in the STEM field. So what can you take away from the life of Benjamin Franklin and apply to your mentorship and teach kids?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that is what Robbie just said. We're really allowing students to have the opportunities to explore early on. Benjamin Franklin had the opportunity to do a lot of tinkering and be an apprentice when he was, 12 or younger. And so, the earlier the students can get involved in engineering or science activities, the more their mind can expand and they can begin to discover all of these different possibilities that exist in the world. So, taking from what Benjamin Franklin did, and applying those principles to the education system today, I think it's really critical for young people to have the opportunities to discover science, to ability to try things and fail, but learn from those failures, to be able to tinker and to play around with different, science and physics principles to really understand how the world exists and how things are made and how things come together. So these are a lot of great principles that we are actually trying to apply in the work that we do here in Chicago.
And I think all of that kind of is addressed in this next clip we're going to watch. So let's roll another clip from Benjamin Franklin.
Despite his lack of a formal education, Franklin had turned himself into an influential writer and thinker. Now, with more time to pursue whatever intrigued his restless imagination, he would become better known as a scientist and inventor. He studied the Earth's rotation, conducted experiments showing that dark cloths absorb more heat than bright fabrics, and became fascinated by the human body's circulatory system.
He loved anatomy. He loved botany. He loved the way leaves had veins. He was most curious to know everything you could know about everything that was possibly knowable. Wanting to know everything is the key to his creativity.
He observed weather patterns and correctly deduced that the coastal storms now called nor'easters actually moved in from the south. For an ailing brother, he fashioned a more comfortable catheter. And he designed a metal stove to fit into a hearth, improving on the ones many German immigrants were using. Franklin's radiated more heat out into the room and had an opening for those who still wished to bask in the fire's glow. An iron worker who was a fellow Junto member began manufacturing them, and they sold for £5 each throughout the Northeast. When Franklin was urged to take out a potentially lucrative patent on his invention, he declined.
As we enjoy great advantages from the invention of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by an invention of ours. And this we should do freely and generously.
But nothing he did as a scientist would do more to serve others and bring him more fame than his work in the fledgling field of electricity. I never was before engaged in any study, Franklin wrote, that so totally engrossed my attention and my time.
Franklin had become interested in electricity, which at the time was certainly not understood, but it was also a sort of a parlor trick. People would come in with a glass rod and some silk and shock each other and lift pieces of paper.
He and his Junto friends staged electricity parties in which they used a charge to ring bells and make a toy he called an electrical spider jump around. Men and women exchanged electrical kisses. Franklin also electrified a gilt-edged portrait of King George II that created what he called a high treason shock if someone touched his crown. He used a more powerful shock to kill a turkey and reported that it seemed uncommonly tender compared to one slaughtered the conventional way.
He kept saying we have to find useful things to do with this electricity. He said one of the only useful things in his first year of experiments was that he would get shocked and knock him down. And he said electricity was useful for making a vain person humble.
As his studies turned more serious and he began documenting his observations, he came up with new terms to describe electricity's mysterious properties. It had two charges, he wrote, positive and negative, and it could travel by what he called a conductor. He grouped a collection of glass containers together, each possessing an electrical charge, and named it a battery, using the military term for an array of cannons.
Benjamin Franklin comes up with the most important theory of the era, which is the single fluid theory of electricity, which is that it's not some substance, but it's a positive and a negative, and it flows from positive to negative.
But pure science had less appeal to Franklin than putting it to practical use.
All right, so Rabiah Mayas, when you look at those early experiments, I mean, he coined the word battery. That's an amazing story. How key were those theories and those experiments into developing electricity?
I mean, they were foundational, right? I mean, I think about the fact that what we take for granted when we turn things on, plug in a battery powered item. When we think about here at the museum, we have a huge Tesla coil that we fire every 45 minutes, and you can see literally electricity, the impact of electricity jumping across a space. It really impacts everything that we have done in the modern era. And I think what's really powerful about the documentary, the clip we just saw, but really probing the process of how he discovered is what's typically left out of what we learn in school, right? We learn about the theory, we learn about the conclusion. We don't typically learn about how that was developed. And one of the things we know about how science is done well, the kind of skills we want to instill in young people and learners of all ages is that process of asking questions, developing a hypothesis, testing it, revising your hypothesis with new data, right? And making a conclusion or making an argument from the evidence that you have. So it is the work he did in electricity is foundational, and really the how and the process of how those discoveries were made continue to be incredibly relevant, right? Setting up experiments to test an observation that we've made is still how we do science in a lot of ways. And so that is standing the test of time, even though obviously things have become much more modern.
And so David Schmidt, talking about this scientific process, how did he apply that kind of thought to his views on politics and independence and self-government and writing a constitution?
Yeah. So I think a scientist knows that what we should all know, that doubling down on a mistake is just stupid. And so he, I think, I talked earlier about his early in life, into the middle of his life. So we can't blame it on just the being young, but he was engaged in the institution of slavery in the middle of his life. But later in life, he didn't just double down on that mistake. He accepted that this was a wrong that he had. And poor Richard would say, the wise and brave dares own that he is wrong. That's Benjamin Franklin's character. So I think that, as I say, doubling down on a mistake is no good. And then in the politics, he believed in the Constitution as an experiment, as something that we can improve as we go along. He's the one who gave us the phrase self-evident to the famous sentence in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Originally, it was, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. That edit makes our country founded on truth and science and observation and fact, and not something more mystical that sacred and undeniable had. So I think that he brought his science with him into his future careers.
It's pretty incredible how science basically informed the founding of the country, the scientific process and scientific thought. Jason, we talked a little bit about, the fact that in his earlier to midlife years, he was a slave owner. How complicated is that when you want to teach kids about Benjamin Franklin and about, the advances that he made, but also deal with the reality that this was someone that engaged in something an institution that was definitely evil before finally, coming around to being an abolitionist.
No, I mean, to be honest, I personally didn't know that Benjamin Franklin was a slave owner. And so, I don't think that's a historical fact that is talked about a lot. Watching the clip, it kind of, took me by surprise, but, during the era, I guess it shouldn't be a big surprise that, most folks, especially at his level, probably did own slaves. But, from a historical context in school, once again, I don't think that it's talked about. But I think it is something that, young people should be aware of. And it shouldn't take away from, what he contributed to this, to the science world. But it is, a fact about who he is as a person as well. And although he did change, it's still a part of his life that, that I guess that he took ownership of,
And Rabiah Mayas, how about that for you as someone who probably loves him as a scientist, but maybe has to wrestle with complicated emotions, knowing that part of his history, and again, then seeing the end of his life where he fought for abolition. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, I don't know that I love him as a scientist. I think I appreciate the contributions that he made to, to this country and to science. And I think I can hold complex views on his life and his history, right? And so what I appreciate about the documentary is really bringing that to light, is I think pushing the viewers to acknowledge that most of us as human beings are complex, right? We have nuanced and very dynamic progressions across our life. And I think that the opportunity here is to not paint with rose-colored glasses these ideas of who people were based on the contributions they made, right? People can make great contributions and have problematic histories. And I think where science leads into that is that science itself also can be very nuanced and complex, right? I think we all saw COVID, right? As we're thinking about masking and vaccination and what's the right thing to do now, and what we knew in April 2020 is very different from what we knew in April 2021. And that's not because the early science was wrong. It's what it was at the time. It was complex, it was evolving, it was changing. And so we had to revise our models and our interpretation of the data. So I think if we view people with a similar approach, right? What is the evidence? What are the conclusions I can draw from this evidence of a person's life, and acknowledge that we're complex, but also hold people accountable, right? To the lives that they lived. And I think historically, certain people, largely white men, have been able to be complex and nuanced and forgiven or excused. And lots of people, women and people of color, often don't get that benefit, right? So that, I think, is one of the learnings, is how can we look through people with a critical, honest lens, acknowledge their contributions, and acknowledge and hold accountable to their challenges.
And David, it certainly seems like that was the name of the film here, to tell the true story, the full story, the good and the bad. How important was that? To not paint with rose-colored glasses, tell the whole thing.
I'm often asked, how can we reconcile these two things about Benjamin Franklin? And I don't understand why we have to. I mean, reconcile is an accounting word. It's other things too, but it's an accounting word. And if you look at it from an accounting context, it's balanced. It's this equals this. There's no reason to go there. I don't need balance. I need truth. And the truth is, he enslaved people. And the truth is, at the end of his life, he was an abolitionist. Now, it's the very end of his life. It's a bit convenient in some ways to the telling of his story that you can say, well, he was an abolitionist in the end. But it is important that somebody of Benjamin Franklin's stature lent his name and his clout to the anti-slavery movement. So we have to tell those stories. We have to tell all those stories, and we try to tell them without judgment, and to let other people take it how they want to, because balance is not possible. And whether something is good or bad, or somebody is good or bad, well, everybody's both. And your view, Paris, might be different from mine, but all of it is true, no matter our judgment.
And it seems like that reflects kind of the thinking of Benjamin Franklin himself, and his desire to become a better person and to continually learn. Jason, there is a passage in the film where he talks about visiting a school with Black children, and then realizing, oh, wait a second, they're just as smart as everybody else. So coming to modern day, you are dealing with kids that are underrepresented in the science field, in the STEM fields. What are the barriers right now, and how do you fix those barriers?
I mean, so there's a lot of systemic barriers that are in place and have been in place for hundreds of years in this country. And so I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, honestly. But I think access and opportunity is one of the big barriers. Schools that many Black and brown children attend are just not equipped, at the schools of their counterparts. But also just opportunities. I mean, we just need more opportunities within our communities to show students the different different careers that they can go into. They need to be able to experience, have different experiences that allow them to truly understand all the possibilities that exist. And then we need just nurturing adults around these young people. And so, without all of that, we're going to continue to have more systematic issues within our community. But definitely, you know, the opening statement that you said about like how he just recognized that these Black children were equally as smart. I mean, most definitely that's a true statement. But you know, the fact that for such a long time, you know, Black people were believed to be, you know, subhuman or not smart or, you know, things is just, you know, just a crazy statement to me, to be honest. And so, you know, I'm glad that he was awakened. I don't, you know, I'm surprised that it took so long, but you know,
Yeah.
you know, people have their own different prejudice and understandings of different people, and so I'm just glad to hear that, you know, he finally did see the light and understand that we are all equal.
You know, he says in that moment, I think a lot of people hear that story, or some people hear that story and they want to say, oh, look at him, how wonderful it is that he saw this. It's like, you know, he had enslaved people in his home and he's dealing with their humanity daily. And if he didn't realize it from that, then how are we supposed to honor this transition? I don't think we should. He does say in that moment, you should perhaps think that I ever held this prejudice. How could I have ever held this prejudice? And I will not try to account for it. And I think that rather than honoring him for coming to that conclusion, which he should have had from the start, or for honoring him for coming to the conclusion of, hey, let's be abolitionists in the end, I think that those are important things that happen and that we should talk about them. But the thing that I want to see in myself is just to honor the ability to change. And so it's not that he arrived at this conclusion that he should have had from the start, but it's that he's challenging himself, which I think does come back to the scientist in him, that, you know, I've got to keep revisiting this. Yeah, it's not a pretty prejudice that he started with, and the conclusion is not necessarily something we need to celebrate, but the ability to change, I think, is something that we can look for in ourselves.
Well, it's almost like the scientific process again is getting him to at some point finally challenge his prejudice. He's seeing evidence now that his prejudice was wrong, you know, and it wasn't truthful. I mean, just going from some of the passages in your film, Rabiah, I want to pose the same question to you about barriers for you know, children of color, students of color who get into STEM fields. What are the ways that you see, because education is such a big part of what you do, what are the ways that you see to improve that?
Yeah, so, you know, certainly at the museum, I mean, our entire mission statement is to inspire the inventive genius in everyone, right? Period. And so, you know, implicit in that is that everyone has inventive genius in them, right? And at the museum, we find it our job to help inspire and activate that. And so I come from the place of believing that every child is brilliant and has potential as a default. And it's our job as caring adults, as educators, to provide the protective factors, support, resources, access, opportunities, as Jason said, for them to activate that inner brilliance in whatever way, you know, they can. And science is such a powerful way to do that. I agree with Jason that we really have, you know, centuries of systemic issues that have really been established by design to keep certain populations and demographics out of STEM, for example. And one of the things I certainly know as a young person, as a young Black woman who was going into the natural sciences, one of the things that was incredibly powerful for me that I know is not everyone's experience is that I had authentic research experiences in the sciences. So Ben Franklin had an apprenticeship. I worked in a lab when I was 13. And the person who was the PI, the principal investigator, the head researcher in that lab was a Black woman who had a family, and she was running a major grant funded project and doing science every day. And so for me, it was never not the norm that someone who looked like me, represented me in some kind of way, was successful in the sciences, right? So the media and all of the other messages that we get were buffered to some extent because of that experience. And so one of the things that we focus on in our work, and I think, you know, Jason's work and others too, is ensuring that we are supporting the positive elements of systems in terms of representation and mentors and connections so that young people can see themselves, but also see the possibility in ways that are really personal and relevant.
Jason, this is, you know, the foundation of the work that you do. Is that what you see? I mean, these things having a major impact, the things that Rabiah brought up?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. So just as Rabiah stated, we definitely try to surround our students with positive role models so that they can see themselves in these roles. It's super important for young people to envision themselves as, you have a successful career in these different areas, or knowing that this is something that they can do. It's about self-identity as a STEM professional. Like, how can I, as a young person, truly identify as somebody within this future role? And so we definitely surround our people with, positive role models who look like them. We try to take them to view different, engineering firms and different corporations that do this type of work so that they can understand what it's like to be an engineer or a scientist at these specific companies. We take them on college field trips so that they really understand like what their journey into these types of careers will look like. And then while we have them, within our programs, then we provide them with all of the experiences and skill building opportunities so that they are able to, jump over those hurdles that they'll get to, later on in their career. But it's all about, positive affirmation for our young people and showing them the way to, to the finish line.
It's so key. David, I want to talk about, Benjamin Franklin's relationship with religion. I mean, I knew that the founders were Enlightenment thinkers and not necessarily too keen on the organized religion of the day. I was surprised to find that Franklin was spiritual, did at some point at least believe in a God. So how did his spiritual views, his kind of anti-establishment religion views weigh into the founding and to the Constitution?
Yeah. Well, the rest of that sentence that I was talking about earlier, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator is the next phrase, right? So there is a slightly spiritual bent in that really important sentence in our history. I think when we talk about founders, who are we necessarily talking about? Are we just talking about the guys that are on the bills? They might be more of our enlightened deist peoples, but that generation that won the American Revolution is a coalition of all sorts of different people, including the next generation after the Great Awakening in North America, which was very religious. So I think he was somebody who could cooperate with other people who he needed to help get to a common goal. He could compromise, and sometimes that's got horrible consequences for people. Sometimes it's finding common ground that benefits all. And I think that his personal relation to the idea of a supreme being was a pretty standoffish person who wants you to do good to your fellow man. That's at least what he said in his writings. And it wasn't so much about your devotion to that person, so much as what good you can do. And I personally like that. And I think that that is something that finds its way at least into the rhetoric around the American Revolution. Whether it makes its way actually into the systems that he's a part of creating those systems when we talk about systematic is a question that other people might want to be interested in answering themselves.
Well, and Rabiah, this kind of leads me into a question I've talked to with you about, with innovation, with science, there's a moral component here. There's so many examples in human history of major advances that maybe they might not necessarily have been good. They were advances technologically, but did they lead to better results for humankind? So what about that moral aspect of science?
It's so hard, right? Because I think it's hard to balance. And I don't know that we've been socialized or trained to think about innovation in that context, right? It's, we're out identifying challenges and coming up with really exciting solutions. And of course, there's always some kind of cost benefit analysis. But when we think about long-term implications and consequences of innovation, whether it's around impacts on the environment or on health or, potential nefarious uses of new technology, what I find really interesting is one, just the ethics of innovation and technology and who gets to decide what's ethical in innovation and technology, because often, as we've seen, the negative consequences, the people who bear the brunt of the negative consequences are not representative of the populations that also benefit, right? We know that there is absolutely significant disadvantage or disproportional, I should say, impacts of global climate change on lower income and indigenous and communities of color, right? And those communities were not responsible for the innovation. They weren't brought to the table to make decisions about how are we going to, right, move some of these systems forward. So I think it's an interesting conversation around how can we be more inclusive in the innovation process so that the voices who will consider and ask the questions about the ethics for all people, not just the ones in the room perhaps making a decision, is really important. So the movement towards inclusion in innovation, I think, has this really important element of the innovation itself, yes, but also the impact, short-term and long-term, and ensuring that they are distributed equitably, which historically has not been the case.
Jason, how does that factor into STEM education and getting more, kids that are underrepresented into these fields to talk about these ethics issues that Rabiah brings up?
No, I mean, to be honest, at our age, I don't think that's a major discussion. We're mostly focused on trying to educate our young people and give them the tools and the skills to be able to create solutions. But we also are helping our young people understand like how engineering can impact the community around them. So, how can they be change agents for their community through engineering? How can they create innovations that can help provide solutions within their own community? So, if there's healthcare disparities, like how can engineering impact that? If we're talking about pollution or trash, like how can they utilize engineering to do that? If you think back about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, like how can engineering, or science impact that? So, we are trying to teach our young people how engineering can be utilized for good, but not necessarily having major discussions, I would say, about the ethical issues about, how engineering can be used for wrong, or some of the inequities or things like that.
But certainly those are incredibly important points. And David, I want to get back to the political aspect for a second. This might be an impossible question to answer. American democracy is in a weird place right now in the last several years. What do you think Benjamin Franklin would make of it?
He said when he was proposing the Constitution for its final vote, September of 1787, he said, "I think our enemies would look at us and expect us to be at each other's throats, cutting each other's throats." And these being the so-called United States, which were the 13 colonies, now states, and how somebody from South Carolina and somebody from New England were not of the same country until that war. And I think he would not be. I think he might be surprised it took this long in some ways, but I think he'd also be. I think he'd really not like the lies that are told. I think that there's always been disagreement, but it's usually been disagreement about something that people just have different takes on a truth, and they have different values. And some of the stuff that's happening right now is just like, I believe this thing that is demonstrably not true. And Franklin, as a scientist, would not like that. So, it is probably an impossible question, but I'll answer just that facet of it.
Truth is essential in democracy, and it's also essential in science. Another connection between these things. And I want to remind everybody that, please, if you have questions, submit them to the Q&A function here. And we do have one that came in, so I'm going to go. I don't know the name of this person, but this is a great question, and one that we could talk in another seminar on, and my favorite topic. What are the benefits and negative aspects of the invention of social networks like Facebook? Rabiah, getting back to innovation is great, and sometimes it leads to things that don't improve lives in some respects.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I had just made a commitment maybe to get off Facebook, but I think one of the things that I don't know that I can answer that question broadly, because I think there are lots of answers to it, right? But I think those of us who have used social media, and certainly when it was newer, the ability to connect with people from afar, to share information, to share photos, right? Many of us started on Facebook because it was a way to be in touch with family members and friends from college who you didn't see, right? It was just that. And then the layers upon layers, I think, that evolve over time in terms of data collection and advertising and facial recognition and all of these other elements that I think most users never would have anticipated, starts to change the analysis, right? It changes the equation. So each of us, I think, as we think about our use of technology, right? I think about my smartphone. Should I buy an electric vehicle? Do I take showers too long? Like all of the analyses we're doing constantly in our head. I think to some extent, we don't realize some of the potential negative consequences of something like social media until we're using it. And then we start to see whether it's about, really disconnection socially, right? So what we thought was actually a social connection tool is actually pushing us farther apart. The entire research scandal, which we could have a whole hour of conversation on, right? The amount of data that we've made willingly available is extraordinary and scary, right? We didn't know that in 2008 when we signed up, right? So I think the idea of scientific thinking is so critical because that is the analysis. With new information, what conclusion do I draw about this technology? And is it still good for me? And if so, how might I use it? That's a scientific process all in and of itself. And so I think, again, as we encourage young people and adults to apply scientific thinking to their life, how do you do these analyses? Because what was true for you in 2010 might not be true for you in the same way in 2020. And that's okay, right? But how do you then adjust and modify and make different decisions and draw different conclusions?
Yeah, and so we get a really interesting chat comment here. Perhaps it is similar to nuclear power, scientific advance with many negatives, and thus, the moral component here of science, incredible advance that has the possibility to change lives for the better or end lives. It's just depending on how it's used. I want to encourage anyone else to weigh in on the chat function.
I love that example about nuclear power too, because I think, there are, when we think about risks and consequences, there's the probability of a negative consequence, and then there's the severity, right? So when we think about a nuclear disaster, that is rare, but incredibly severe, right? And so that's part of the analysis, right? When you're doing the risk benefit analysis of these things, what is the likelihood of something happening? And what is the severity of something happening? Again, that's the analysis with COVID, right? What is the likelihood of perhaps getting COVID if I engage in this particular activity? And then what is my personal risk factor of having a serious COVID complication? Just to use that as a recent example, that's the analysis we're all doing, right? That is scientific skill-based thinking that leads us to make decisions and have conclusions about, how we live our lives.
Well, and since we don't have any more questions, we have a little extra time. David, I want to go back to what you were saying before about another kind of unknown aspect about Benjamin Franklin's life was the relationship with his son.
Yeah.
The fact that his son was a loyalist to the crown. Can you talk about that a little more? And the fact, correct me if I'm wrong, Franklin himself was sympathetic to Britain for a while and then shifted after he saw what happened. So talk about that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, they were incredibly close. They every job that Franklin had in Pennsylvania, he managed to help his son get it through a thing called nepotism, which is still alive and well. And he went with William and their two enslaved men to London, his son William. And while they were there, Benjamin Franklin helped William get the job of Royal Governor of New Jersey. So from 1763, William is the governor of New Jersey. Benjamin Franklin goes back to London again in 1765. So for those 10 years before the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin is in London representing the colonies, and William is in the colonies representing the crown. And that is when the fabric of the British Empire falls apart. That early British Empire, the transatlantic American British Empire, fell apart, and they just come on opposite sides. And the one in America sides with Britain, and the one in Britain sides with America. And when Benjamin Franklin comes back, he doesn't raise a finger to help his son when he's imprisoned. He instead doubles down on his pro-revolution rhetoric. He goes to France to help negotiate the alliance with France that will win the American Revolution. William Franklin is imprisoned. After his imprisonment, he coordinates terrorist raids against patriots in New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. After the war, Benjamin Franklin never forgives him. Now, he says to him, there are natural duties which precede political ones, which is rich for somebody who was away from his family for 20 years for political reasons. But it is an incredibly fascinating story and indicative of what was going on for all sorts of families in North America at the time. We talk about our Civil War, the American Civil War of the 1860s is brother versus brother. It wasn't in the way that the American Revolution was, where it was literally father against son in the case of Benjamin Franklin, one of the most famous people we've ever had.
Certainly breaking up families and friendships. And there's that scene with the letter he writes to his longtime friend saying, you and I were friends. You are now my mortal enemy.
Yeah, and he didn't send it. So there's a little bit of just leaving it in your drafts unsent, but showing it to your friends so that they know where you stand on this issue.
Kind of like the tweet that you don't hit send on. Well, I want to see if we have any more questions. Doesn't look like it. So any other final thoughts from our panelists, Jason, Rabiah, any other things that we didn't get to that you wanted to talk about today?
I think as somebody who, I also grew up on the East Coast, like David, and so the Civil War and the founding of the country was a core part of my early learning. I think what's really powerful about this story in some ways is similar to, I think, why Hamilton was such a draw for people, right? I mean, yes, there's dancing and singing, so this is different, but the idea of, again, having a view of the humanity of these revered innovators and scientists is really powerful. And so I'm really excited to see how this film will get used in learning contexts, right? And to help us really see that these people who, we've often attributed, their lives to being this lone genius who did amazing things, right? Like the fact that I was excited to learn that Ben Franklin was a reader, like an avid reader since he was a child. There are a few things that warm my heart than a little kid reading a book on a bus or in the laundromat or something, like just that voracious, I want to learn things opportunity. And so this idea that we can remember that all of these historical figures were kids once, right? They were learners. They were seeing the world with the exact same eyes that 4-year-olds do now. It's just exciting. I think we don't do that enough. And I think if we, in our work, Jason and my work and things like the film can remind folks that there's a pathway, right? He had how many jobs upon jobs, right? That there's no linear path to achievement and success. That's something that young people need to see it for current folks, but also to see it about historical figures. So I'm excited about that opportunity.
That's a powerful lesson. And I have to say, through the excerpts that we've been able to see of the film, it's just an amazing film, and it's very dramatic, and it just moves very fast, and it's just a great watch. I can't wait for the full film to come out. And Monday, that's it. All right. And I want to thank everyone for being here. David Schmidt, Rabiah Mayas, Jason Coleman, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Paris.
You definitely appreciate it. Thank you to all the folks joining in and participating. And a reminder, as we said, the new documentary, Benjamin Franklin, premieres on WTTW Monday, April 4th, 8 p.m., and then April 5th at 8 p.m. And you can visit WTTW.com/Ken Burns, Benjamin Franklin, to learn more about the upcoming documentary. And for all upcoming WTTW events, please visit WTTW.com/against. Once again, my thanks to all of you, and thanks to our participants for joining us. And one more plug. Tomorrow night, we have the premiere of Jane Byrne, a new Chicago Stories documentary at 8 p.m. on all WTTW platforms. And we're going to have new Chicago Stories documentaries premiering every Friday at 8 p.m. This is really, really exciting. Some great films coming up, produced right here in WTTW. And that's it. Until next time, take care. Thanks, everybody.